Welcome students. Again, another part or another portion that we have to discuss today is the events which are taking place in the sexual reproduction. So here we'll be talking about the various events that are taking place in the process of the sexual reproduction. It has been clearly divided into three different parts, that is the pre-fertilization phase, the fertilization, and the post-fertilization events. It is actually, we have classified or we have divided these to have a better understanding of the process of sexual reproduction in a nutshell, not in the detail we'll go, but just have an outline how to or what steps are there during the process of sexual reproduction. So the when we are talking of that, let us take about the first one, that is the pre-fertilization event. The pre-fertilization event will involve all the events or all the activities that will be taking place prior fertilization, that is the fusion of the gametes. So here the pre-fertilization events are further classified or divided into two. It's a two-step process, that is gametogenesis and the transfer of gametes. When we talk of gametogenesis, it is the process of formation of male and female gametes. So, the gametogenesis is the process of formation of gametes. Now, this formation of gametes is very, very important because the gametes are the actual structures or the part that will be taking that will be having a major role in the fusion or to bring about the syngamy. The gametes are formed as a result of the meiotic division. Now, this gametes, if in the case of diploid organism, it will be a meiotic division. But if the organism is a haploid structure or if it is having a main body as haploid, the gametes produced will be haploid only. So, it is very important for you to understand that the gametes which are formed, whether from unisexual or bisexual, are always haploid in structure and they are carrying only one set of chromosomes. Now, these gametes are not produced by the somatic cells of the body. Instead, they are produced by specialized cells, which we call them as myocytes. And these myocytes will have a diploid. The myocytes are always diploid. They are two end structures, and after going through the process of meiosis or the cell division, that is the reduction in the number of chromosomes, they will produce the gametes, and these gametes which are being produced by them are always haploid structures. So as to restore, when the fusion of these gametes will take place, it will restore the original number of the chromosome which is specific for a species. Now, when we are talking of the formation of the gametes, there are different types of gametes, obviously male and female, but we are classifying or dividing the gametes into two types depending upon their morphology. Now, the two type of gametes which are found in the organisms, that is, the first is isogametes or homogametes. Isogametes or homogametes actually are those gametes which are difficult to differentiate between. That means they are morphologically, the male and the female gametes are morphologically similar, and as a result it is tough or it is almost impossible to identify. For example, if we talk of the chlamydomonas is having similar structure of the male and the female gamete. This is the nucleus we are talking of, and here the male and the female are similar. So these organisms, it becomes difficult to identify or to differentiate between the male and the female gametes. Therefore, such kind of gametes are known as homogametes or isogametes. Another class of gametes is those which can be easily identified as the male and the female. So we call them as heterogametes. These heterogametes, they are morphologically different, that is the male and the female can be easily differentiated. And for example, the human beings, the ova is a round structure, whereas the male is having a tail which is which helps it to move, and also it has a head. It is non-motile and it is motile. But again, if you see morphologically, they are quite different. The heterogamete is, this is very clearly the female and this is very clearly the male. But if we talk over here, there is hardly any difference. So such type of gametes which show similarity in morphologically are called as isogametes, whereas those organisms which have different gametes morphologically and can be easily identified are known as heterogametes. Now coming to the heterogametes, the male is always known as the sperm or the anthrozoid, whereas the female is known as the egg or the ovum. When we talk of the gametes and all these structures, it is important also to understand the sexuality in organism. That means whether the organism is capable of producing both type of gametes or is capable of producing only one type of gamete, that is either male or female. So when we talk of the plants, the plants in which both male and female reproductive structures are present on one plant, these plants will be known as bisexual plants. And bisexual plants are also called as monoecious because they are carrying both reproductive, that is the male and the female reproductive parts in one plant. These plants actually are also called as homothelic. Why we have given this term? Because it is both the type of gametes are produced by the same parent. The functional gametes, because since it is having both male and female reproductive structures, it will be producing both type of gametes and from one parent, functional gametes, and therefore it will be known as homothelic. Whereas the plants in which the male and the female reproductive structures are found in different plants, that means one plant is having only female and the other plant of the same species has only the male reproductive parts. Such plants are known as unisexual or dioecious plants. Obviously, the functional gametes which will be produced by these will be having or will be obtained from different parents, and therefore we will call that as heterothelic. So heterothelic means the functional gametes are produced or they are produced by the different plant but of the same species obviously, and the example is date, palm and papaya. Whereas for the bisexual plant, there are many examples, that is coconut is there, maize is there, which are actually the bisexual plants and produce only both the gametes in the one plant. When we talk about the sexuality in animals, most of the sexually reproducing animals are unisexual, that is they are either male or either female. There are plenty of examples when we see around us. Now these animals, the male animal will be producing the sperm, that is the male gamete, whereas the female will be producing the egg, that is the female gamete. However, we find that there are certain animals which are bisexual, that is having both the male and the female reproductive parts in one organism. Earthworm is a very good example of it. And in the case of animals, such animals which have reproductive parts, both the kind of reproductive parts, that is male and female, in one are known as hermaphrodite. Example is earthworm. Unisexual, you can find many examples. So there are different the process by which the formation of the gametes is taking place, and the meiocytes are actually the cells which are responsible or which undergo the meiotic process to form the gametes, and these gametes are haploid in structure. The meiocytes are therefore also called as germ mother cell. They are also called as the meiocytes will be also referred to as germ mother cells. Depending upon the morphology again, we have isogametes or heterogametes. Isogametes are similar in structure morphologically, and heterogametes, the male and the female gametes, are quite distinct morphologically. Sexuality, again, we have discussed that it is the bisexual or the unisexual. And the bisexual, since it is producing both the type of gametes in one plant, we will call it as homotelic. And the heterothelic are the ones in which the functional gametes are produced by the different parents. Animals, we have hermaphrodite, that is the bisexual animal, having both the male and the female reproductive parts. Earthworm is an example for this. Coming to the fertilization process. Now, before that, we have to have the transfer of gametes. Now, to bring about the fertilization, or before we come to the next step, let us talk about the transfer of gametes. Transfer of gametes is an important phenomena, and it has to take place in such a way so as to bring about the fertilization in an effective manner. So, when we talk of the transfer of gametes in the case of plants, the plants are stationary, and since they have, and therefore they have devised various methods. Now, in when we see the plants in higher and the lower category, the method of transfer of gametes is different. The plants which are lower, such as algae and all, the lower group of plants actually release the gametes. The male, that is the sperm, and the egg are released, and they are mostly in the water, and these are then allowed to fuse. The plants, when they are the plants when they release this, the transfer of gametes, when it is taking place, the bryophytes and all, the water is the main media through which the plants are the plants bring about the process of fertilization. However, now in the case of plants, when the transfer of gametes or this is taking place through the water, a large number of male gamete is being produced over there so as to compensate for the loss, because here large number of gametes may be lost and will not bring about the proper fertilization. Now, in the seed plants, the plants that reproduce by seed or that have formed the seeds, these plants have the pollen grains, and these pollen grains are to be transferred to the stigma of the flower, where the pollen grain develops the pollen tube and reaches the stationary ova. Here the pollen grains are also stationary because they are not motile, as in the case of lower group of plants, where the sperm or the male anthrozoid, which is being anthrozoa, which is being released into the water, is carried by the current of the water to bring about the fertilization. But here, in the case of seed plants, that is angiosperms and pteridophytes and the gymnosperms, these are seed forming plants, and these plants, the male gamete, that is the pollen grain, is not capable of being transferred on its own. So it needs a certain media, and that medium can be the insect, wind, or anything that facilitate the fusion of these pollen grains to land onto the suitable stigma so as to bring about the fertilization. So this part is known as pollination, where the transfer of the pollen grain take place to the stigma of the plant of the same species. Now, in the case of the species that are having both male and female reproductive structures on one plant, in the case of bisexual, that means this is comparatively an easy process, that process of pollination. But the plants that are unisexual, that is having either male or female, the pollen grain needs to be carried. They need a medium to be carried from the main plant to the different plant of the same species so as to bring about the fertilization. So here the transfer of gametes is very, very important. Now, after the gametes are transferred, they need to be or they have to come together to bring about the fertilization. When we talk of fertilization, it is the fusion of the male and the female gamete. Now, this fusion of the male and the female gamete is also known as syngamy, that is fusion. And fertilization will involve all the steps that help to bring about the syngamy process. Now, depending upon whether the fertilization is taking place outside the body of the female or organism, it has been classified as external fertilization and internal fertilization. External fertilization is when the fertilization occurs outside the body of an organism, that is the female. So here the fertilization will take place outside the body of the female, and here it is within the body of the female, within or inside the organism, that is the female. So we have classified it as external fertilization and internal fertilization. Now, when we talk of the fertilization process, that is the external and the internal fertilization, in the case of external fertilization, there are various animals such as the fishes, the amphibians and other group of animals that follow this process, that is the external fertilization, where the male and the female gametes are released into water. Water is therefore a chief medium through which the fertilization happens in the case of the organisms that are reproducing by this method. Whereas the internal fertilization, the male and the female, that is the sperm, one of the structures that is mostly the male gamete is motile, whereas the female gamete is stationary, and it fuses. The male gamete travels all the way up to reach and fuse with the ova. Now, when we talk of the external fertilization and the internal fertilization, there are certain differences, because it is external fertilization, since it is taking place outside the body of the organism. Large number of sperm or the male gametes are to be released into the water to bring about the fertilization process. Now, here the chances of even after the fusion of the gametes, the formation of zygote take place, and the survival of the zygote is very, very important, but the chances are reduced because it is open, or it is very much vulnerable to the predators in the case of external fertilization, and therefore it also corresponds that therefore there is a very clear-cut relation that more number of sperms or the female gametes are being released by these animals in the water. Internal fertilization, although the large number of male gametes are produced, but the fertilization, since it is much like we can say it's safe because the development is taking place inside the body of the female, the chances of fertilization are more, and also therefore the number of male gametes produced are much more as compared to the number of the female gamete. The number of the female gamete is restricted so as to have a balance. Now, this is the external and the internal fertilization we are talking about. But there are certain example, or there is an exception to fertilization, where then individual develops without fertilization. That means the female egg, the female egg, it develops directly without fertilization into an individual or offspring. And this process, the female egg, when develops into individual without the fertilization, it is known as parthenogenesis. It is known as parthenogenesis. And it is a very rarely we find that male gamete develops into that. But if the female, in the case of honeybee, rotifers are actually known as wheel animals, and they are have cilia around their mouth, and they look like they look like giving the appearance of a wheel, and therefore they are known as rotifers. So rotifers, amphids, honeybee, these are examples of organisms that undergo the process of parthenogenesis, where actually the female egg does not undergo the mating, or it does not involve the fusion with the sperm, or no fertilization is taking place, and it develops into an individual. However, it is interesting for you to know that in the case of honeybees, when the honeybees are developing, uh, the fertilized egg will form the female, whereas the unfertilized egg, which is due to parthenogenesis, develops into the drones. So the fertilized in case of honeybee will develop as a female, whereas the unfertilized, which undergoes parthenogenesis, develops into the drone. So this, we were talking about the parthenogenesis in the case of fertilization, which is an exception to this. Coming to the post-fertilization events. Post-fertilization events are those events that happen after the fusion or the syngamy has happened. Now, we know that the zygote, which is being obtained due to the fusion of the gametes, is a diploid structure. So, the first is, when we talk of this, the post-fertilization events, post-fertilization events can be again divided, or being we can easily study under the two steps, that is the zygote formation, and second is the embryogenesis. The zygote formation actually happens, the first step, the male gamete and the female gamete fuse, that is the fertilization happens to produce two end, and this structure is known as zygote. So zygote is the first cell formed. It is a diploid structure and it is the first cell formed, and then this zygote undergoes several mitotic division to form the embryo, and there this embryo then develops into the second part we talk of embryogenesis. This embryo then develops into an individual after repeated division. There are different stages of this. After the embryo, the blastula is formed, and later on many other stages are formed. And this leads to the formation of an individual. And after the certain period where the complete development of the young one has taken place, it is being uh, the individual is allowed to be developed, and it is present, or it is then developing as an individual. So the embryogenesis is taking place after the formation of the zygote. Now, this in the process of embryogenesis, the cells multiply by mitotic division, and also they undergo the cell differentiation. Cell differentiation is the process in which the organism cells, they tend to acquire, or they modify themselves to perform various functions. Now, depending upon the organism's capability, that whether the development of the organism taking place outside the body of the female or inside, or it is laying eggs, or it is or it is giving birth to the young ones, we have oviparous and viviparous animals. Oviparous animals are those animals in which the development of the embryo takes place outside the body of the female, and in these cases, an egg is being laid by the female. The egg has an outer hard covering which is calcareous, that means it is made up of calcium carbonate, and this protects. Example is birds, snakes, reptiles, many are there which reproduce by the formation of egg, that means which form the egg, and this egg, within that the nutritional material is available to the embryo, where the cell multiplication, cell differentiation takes place, and the organism is developed within the egg. And on reaching certain stage of development, or when the individual is completely formed, it breaks open the shell, and in these organisms, the number of individuals or the eggs produced will be more, obviously, so as to maintain the number of the species. The viviparous, on the other hand, will give birth to the young ones. For example, the human beings. In this case, the entire development of the organism or the individual or the offspring takes place within the female body, and as a result, it will be a much safer, because this is exposed to various environmental conditions and other predators. Here the development is very safe because it is taking place within the female body. Coming to the plants also have devised the method so as to have the complete, we say, the development of the baby. Now, in flowering plant, the zygote is formed inside the ovule, and normally after the fertilization, the other accessory parts of the plant, such as the petals, the other structures which are there, because we know in flowering plants the petal is important to attract the insects to bring about the pollination. So all these structures wither off, with an exception of brinjal and few other plants, and such condition in which any of the part of the flower is remaining is known as corticus condition, that you have studied in the previous class. Now here the zygote will develop. In the case of plants, the zygote develops into the embryo. This is in all. And the ovules develop into the seed. So the ovary which is being there present, the ovary is present or is carrying the ovules, the ovary develops into the fruit in the case of plants, and especially when we are talking of seed forming plants, the ovary develops into the fruit, and they have a thick wall which is known as pericarp. This pericarp is protective, and actually it helps or it provides the nutrition to the developing embryo. Now, when we talk of pericarp, one very good example is pea. You must have seen the pea, and here this green is the pericarp, and these rounded structures are the ovules. We have several examples of this where the zygote is formed, and the zygote develops into an embryo, the ovule develops into seed, ovary into fruit, and it has this structure which is known as the pericarp, and the pericarp is protective in nature. Also, it provides nutrition, and here the complete fertilization events that are taking place in the sexually reproducing organisms. Hope this must have helped you. Thank you.